I'm Mark Bouris and this is Straight Talk.
So there's always a story behind a story, right? So, just trying to get a bit of an understanding.
Floods, fires, pandemics, unpredictable gangsters. New South Wales Police Commissioner Commissioner Webb has taken on a difficult job.
If your personal values are no longer aligned to the organisational values, then it's time to find another job. If there's people out there that just go, I'm not going to do the job because she's female, there's a gap then between their personal values and the organisational values. So
why did it take so long for this guy to get arrested
I can understand, particularly for the families, they want answers, all families in those circumstances do. Any victim of crime wants answers and resolution, but we're dealing with criminals who, think like criminals.
The relationship between the public and police is fractured.
We debriefed, I guess you could say, some potential recruits about why they're not pursuing their interest to join the police. And one was that they didn't like what the police did during COVID. And the other was around Black Lives Matter. So there's a couple of things that have actually affected our appeal, which is, something we have to grapple with.
I mean, one of the things that always concerns me is potential for peripheral damage from these gang wars as an innocent bystander.
There's rhetoric that, they're only shooting themselves, but there is always a risk. They're very public these days. Some of them are, in gyms and public places, and, that just confounds me that they're so brazen.
Is that something that keeps you awake?
Of course it does.
Irritating all this space. Commissioner Commissioner Webb, welcome to Straight Talk.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You don't mind if I call you Karen?
Go for it.
So who is Commissioner Webb? Where did she come from?
So country girl, grew up in the country, born in the country, educated in the country, and then moved to the city when I finished my HSC, got work, studied, and, so it went from there. But really my roots are still in the country in a way. My family's still in the country. I've got ties to that place and it's still called that home in many ways. But I've lived in Sydney now, in and out of Sydney, but back in Sydney for probably longer than I did in the country. So I should count myself as a city girl, but can't quite do that.
Well, that's interesting in itself from my point of view. Which part of the country, are you from the bush or are you from a farming
So we just lived on the outskirts of town, but it's a small town. So 1,200 people, southwest slopes of New South Wales. So in a small town, you've got to, learn to make the most of what you got around you, which interestingly now I think that put me in good stead. I grew up, I'm only girl in a family of boys, all boys in the street. You learn to fit in with the boys or you don't do anything. And you don't have all the resources that you'd have in a big town or a city. So you, make your own fun and work out your own issues.
So when you were a kid, did you like police people?
I didn't really have any involvement with the local police officers. We had two in the town. Their kids went to the school and that's as much as I'd had to do with them until I was old enough to get my driver's licence. And back in the day, it's a few years ago now, you had to go to the local police station to do your driver's test and they'd issue your licence on behalf of the RMS. And so the police officer there, just a lovely guy and just instantly felt a warmth and comfort around him, even though he's big in stature. And he said, I've seen you drive around. I know you can drive. We'll go for a drive and I'll ask you a few questions. But I just thought right then at that instant, he just had that way of connecting with people and, a rapport, even fleetingly. But I just thought if that's what a police officer is, then I want to be a part of that.
It's like old school.
It is.
Old school policing.
Yeah.
And certainly in a country town. There's probably some old school policing in the city, which we don't want to repeat, but that's the sort of old school policing that the community wants to see.
Yep.
And that's something that impressed upon you that perhaps that you might have considered a career as a police person at that point?
Yep, at that very point.
At that point?
At that point.
Oh, wow.
Up until then, I thought about being a school teacher. Like I knew you'd have to leave the town. There's no employment for women necessarily unless you, stayed on the land or something. Yeah, that was the turning point. So I set my sights on it then. And
how old were you then?
16, 17, I think.
That's
when you get
pretty determined.
Yeah.
Are you a determined sort of person?
Can be.
But
not stubborn, determined.
Well, there's a difference. Stubborn can be a bit silly sometimes. You're a bit irrational, but determined means that you decided that no matter what, you're going to pursue a career as a police person.
Yeah. And which I knew meant that I'd have to move to Sydney and even though training was in Goulburn, but set yourself up to be in Sydney and start the process of applying. Back then, I'm talking 1987, there was a bit of a queue to join the police, and so I worked in the meantime while I did all my tests and went through the recruitment days, etc. And then got the phone call and said, you're in the next class basically. And so, okay, off I go, off to Goulburn.
How many women would have been joining the police force in those days?
So 10%. I think there were 20 in my class of 200.
Yeah, 10%.
Yeah.
Intake.
Yeah.
And what was it like being in Goulburn? My cousin was down in Goulburn. I heard lots of stories about Goulburn. What was it like down in Goulburn? That's where the police go and do their that's your academy.
Yes.
Yep.
And it's been there for 37 years now, I think. But Bouris, where I grew up, is actually not that far from Goulburn. So in terms of climate, sort of familiar with it. I went there in May and attested in August. So I lived Goulburn climate for 3 months. But quickly realised that you're in a group of 200 people all in the same boat, came from everyone's different stories, backstories and different walks of life, but you're all there for a purpose and you make friends. And, I'm still friends with some of those people today. So you just get in because you're like, we've got to support each other getting through the academy. We supported some getting through their exams, some getting through their physical fitness, just to make sure we all marched off that parade ground on the 7th of August.
And do you think at that point, back when you were coming out of the academy, do you think you felt as though there was equivalence between male and female? It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. You're all there for a certain purpose, objective.
Yeah.
Was there equivalence? Did you feel equivalence in yourself?
I think, I think the point I made earlier about grew up in a family of boys and a community of boys, I actually didn't see gender. So when I joined the police and there were actually 20 females, that was a lot for me in a funny sort of way. So I didn't have anything to benchmark it against and say, oh, that's not many or that's a lot. It was a fact. And the girls lived in one tower or 2 towers and the boys were separate. We were all segregated. And so it was actually an interesting thing for me to form relationships with females that I hadn't really done before. So, and like I said, made lifelong friends and, it was a really good experience. But, we'd all, as I said, pitched in, helped each other, had some fun, just supported each other through it. And I thought, they're really important values, particularly in a job like this, where teamwork and working together is so important that you need to trust each other. And so that's, I guess, the good thing about Goulburn, although it's cold and awful sometimes, that you're out of your normal social network and cocoon and you've got to establish new relationships and form those bonds where you have to rely on and trust other people.
The interesting thing about your job too is that you're effectively the CEO of one of the biggest organisations in New South Wales, or probably Australia, in terms of numbers of people, probably in terms of budgets and every other thing, and in terms of importance as well. But most CEOs get drafted into the role of CEO. Very few start from, in your case, right at the very bottom, that is at the academy. And having those relationships and sort of understanding those relationships and helping each other get through the process of passing your exams so that you can become a probationary constable or whatever they call them. Is that what they call them? Yeah, probationary constable, which sort of indicates to me that we're still watching and we might turf you out if you don't do the right thing or toe the line. That's pretty powerful in terms of where you are today. I mean, given where you are today, do you ever look back and say, yeah, I understand what's going on there. I get it. I see how how competitive it is, what they've got to do to pass these exams, how important it is to have culturally everybody sort of trying to help each other through the process.
Yeah, I think it is. I go down to the academy before each passing out parade and talk to the students. So they're all nervous and excited and they've made it, right? So they're ready to march out the next day in front of their families and throw their hats in the air and they'll become a police officer. But it's important for me, I get as much out of that as whether they get anything or not. But, they get the chance to hear from me and what my expectations are, my chat about values and, that their values need to be aligned to our values, et cetera. But it's good for me to go back and just see them, those bright faces and think, that's where I started. We all started there and we, grew up in this organisation, went on different paths, different directions, but we all share the same purpose. It doesn't matter whether you're a probationary constable or a commissioner. And what I say to them is the community looks at you as a leader. They don't know that you're a probationary constable or that I'm the commissioner. They might because I'm older, but they still look at you as a leader and they look to you for guidance and leadership when they need it. So rank really doesn't matter. I've got responsibility as a CEO, but each officer has responsibility as a leader in their community.
What do you think the community thinks the police officer's purpose is?
Well, I think keeping our community safe, but keeping our community safe often is not just, locking up the bad guys, that's part of it, of course, but preventing crime. We want to prevent crime and we want to stop people being victims of crime, and whether that's stop houses being broken into or cars being stolen or prevent domestic violence. I mean, that's the ultimate, really. If we can prevent crime, then we're all in a good place as a society. But certainly, we've got a role to be peacekeepers, in our communities. But I also say we are members of our community. We just happen to wear a blue shirt.
And it probably goes even more these days, a little bit beyond it, because we've had bushfires and we've had floods.
Yeah.
I mean, I just know what I look to the police for as looking at an officer. I mean, it could be any number of things at any one particular
Sure.
time. Could be different.
Yeah.
Not just to keep me safe or keep the bad guys off the street or girls, bad people off the street. But it could also be just a helping out when there's a flood, like up in Lismore recently.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the thing. And I often say, and you mentioned, we're a big organisation, 22,000 staff covering, population of 8 million in New South Wales, but we're a 24/7 agency, frontline agency. So we're often, there. My officers are there middle of the night and respond to those things. So we are Johnny on the spot, and we do what we have to do. It's all part of keeping people safe, but in those circumstances, in a different way.
That's a good way to describe the police, a frontline agency.
Yeah.
It is an agency, and you could describe the Amber as the same and the Fire is the same. They're frontline agencies to do a specific job. And if you just took the police moniker away, and if you look at it the way you're running a business, you're the CEO of a frontline agency.
Yeah.
That's there to perform a specific task relative to the community. You've got 22,000 people work for you, work under you, work within your environments.
Yeah.
How do you manage 22,000 people? I mean, I've got like a couple of thousand people. I find it like near impossible. How do you do 22,000 people?
I think, being an organisation with a structure, I've got to rely on the structure and use the ranks in between. So we've got, as you mentioned, probation is right up to commissioner, and there's ranks every step of that way. And you just have to use your structure and that line of command, and, things take care of themselves in that respect. And I guess, like most CEOs, that I've got a senior executive that I work with, and I've got a top 200 that I engage with to talk about the priorities so that the messaging is consistent. And but they've got a job to do. It's not my job to overstep, and I think that's, managing that too is important, that I don't, usurp the responsibility of my deputies or my assistant commissioners or anyone else, and just use the structure that's there.
These days,
Yeah.
The structure can wag the dog sometimes because, you've got to, I know I'm in my case, I'm the sort of CEO of my organisation, and once upon a time I could sort of say to them, you do this, you do that, you do this, and expect it to be done. And if it wasn't done, then I could sort of issue consequences. I can still do the same today, but then there's always blowback consequences to me these days, because you've got to be much more, let's call it, sensitive towards people. The people in your organisation would be largely men, mostly men, I'd say. How difficult is that for them to not be issued, but to be standardised and expect a level of a certain standard by a first female in 160 years or something
190,
like that?
I think.
190
I think it is,
years.
yeah.
So how difficult is that?
I actually don't think about it. I just think about the job I've got to do. I've never made my role about my gender. It just happens that I happen to be a female, and, with that I'll bring something different. But really, the organisation, as I said, the structures work. There may be people out there that go, oh, she's a female and I'm not going to listen to anything she says. I actually haven't heard that. And, I do say to officers, whether they're probationers and, my executive, if your personal values are no longer aligned to the organisational values, then it's time to find another job. So if there's people out there that just go, oh, I'm not going to do the job because she's a female, and, there's a gap then between their personal values and the organisational values. So that's a different conversation. But I don't think it's. I haven't seen it. I've been, I really enjoy going out to the field, being out to Broken Hill and up north and out in the suburbs. And I try and get out and walk the ground because I like to do a temperature check, I guess, of the culture of a place and how people are going, personally, and understand, what's their day look like, what's on their mind, what makes their job difficult. And that's not that I'm not confident I don't hear that from those above them, but I think it's important for me to stay in touch with what matters to them. So I've certainly been, well received, and it's been great to go out there and talk to the men and women right across the organisation.
Staying in touch is probably one of the most important parts of culture and people within an organisation. Not just staying in touch with the people who have a direct feed to you, but also getting beyond that, because you want to know what everybody else is actually thinking as opposed to just being fed. So that's a good way a good way for me anyway. It's a good way for me to run my organisation. One thing I do know is when you come into an organisation that pre-existed before you, generally speaking, you've got to get some of your own people involved. People, more important, people you trust, people who know that they've got your back, and in terms of your values and what you want to achieve in relation to the organisation. And by the way, you either live by the sword or you die by the sword. If you've got the wrong values, then you won't make it. So how's that process like? What was that like going when you first got appointed? You've obviously got predecessors, and they've got predecessors, and there's sometimes police stay there for 40 years.
Yeah,
they've been under 3 or 4 different commissioners.
Yeah.
Whether they knew them or liked them or not, it doesn't matter. How do you go through the process? Is that a daunting thing when you walk into the room like that?
Not for me. I think my early years just prepared me well. But I think I often say, and I live by it, I deal with the issue. So not the person. But if it's like, who's got the best skills for what I need, the organisation needs right now, and bringing that team together. And so, I've moved deputies around, I've moved assistant commissioners around, and I moved superintendents around. And that's not about I'm moving someone because I don't like them or for whatever reason. It's about we sit down as an executive and have the discussion about what's needed in the organisation right now. Some of those movements and discussions are about what does that individual need for their own development, if they're, future potential leaders or whatever it is. So I'm actually trying to strike that balance about what's the operational needs, what does the organisation need, and how do I develop my people. So my job is to develop the next team who's going to come in behind me.
Yeah, like you mean your successor?
Yeah, and the team behind that. So I think it's incumbent on me to get as many people ready as I can. And
in terms of your board, which is sort of the minister, what's your interaction with the minister? Like, how often do you meet the minister?
Yeah, once, as often as we need to, but every couple of weeks we have a catch up. But there's usually something we have to talk about.
And do you have to meet the Premier as well?
Yeah, not so often, but I think it's like a structure. Like he's the CEO of government, and I don't have to go bypass my minister to go to him necessarily. Yeah. So I do talk to other ministers, just depending on what the issues are. So during COVID, we had a lot to do with the health minister, and so it's really what's on a needs basis.
I can't remember now, but so COVID hasn't finished, but when COVID sort of finished you got appointed, it was the beginning of this calendar year? Yeah. So let's say COVID was sort of finished. What did you learn from observing how your predecessor dealt with the whole COVID crisis in a political sense? Because there are politics involved in these things, and ministers for health and premiers, and every day standing in front of the bloody media, and have to deal with the media as well, which is, I can imagine, be pretty difficult. And expectations that are built about where the police sit in this, when in fact the police aren't really doing anything. Yeah. I mean, it's really a health issue.
Yeah. Tough. I don't envy him at all. And that was a tough time, and I know that word's used and overused, but it's true. Unprecedented. Like the previous one was 100 years ago, so you couldn't benchmark against anything. And it was evolving, every day there was a new health order, or every second day. And so we had to adapt, and that was hugely challenging, I imagine, So we just had to, work as a team to circle around, what do we got to do now? How do we respond to this? How do we, engage our workforce, communicate to our workforce, and then manage? He spent, a lot of time managing the stakeholders, and we had to then mobilise the workforce.
Yeah, but it's quite. I'd imagine it's quite. Good. One of the stakeholders that makes it more challenging is the media. So managing the media is probably nearly a full-time role for somebody.
Yeah.
You have media managers, people who advise your media. Most people would know this, but what's that interaction between you and your media advisor relative to the media? Do you interact with these people every day? And so, Commissioner, there's a problem. We got Channel 7 at the door or something. I don't know.
Yeah. And that's, the job of Alex and others in the media unit to help understand, there's usually a backstory and there's something going on. So just, understand what the issue is and what we, what our position is, what the concerns are. So there's always a story behind a story, right? So, just trying to get a bit of an understanding.
Because the integrity of the police relative to the community is pretty important.
Yeah.
And there's always an issue, especially these days. There's always an issue, in Indigenous deaths whilst incarcerated. Then you get the particular politicised and media-driven sort of stories around someone who might have committed a crime, whether it's gang crime or something like that, and they all reflect on the integrity of not only you but the whole police force. And is part of your role to protect that integrity?
It is, that I did say recently, there's a lot of pressure. There's been a serious crime. Why isn't it solved yet? And I said it's not CSI. These things, not for lack of will. I've got detectives, fabulous investigators and officers working literally around the clock. And, trawling through every piece of evidence, CCTV, ballistics, forensic evidence, you name it. And they are doing an enormous amount of work, and it just takes time. These things just take time, but they're getting amazing results. And I think today there'll be another arrest for a murder. The reality is it takes time to do it properly and to be able to make sure that it goes before the courts and, hopefully successful through the court process.
Do you think, maybe you've experienced this yourself, but do you think that our community is justified sometimes in saying, why did it take so long for this guy to get arrested for something he did in relation to an individual, in case, I'm talking about the Dawson case, in relation to his wife, for which he got convicted. How come it took so long? Do you see the rational sense in that of the community thinking that?
I can understand, particularly for the families. They want answers. All families in those circumstances do. Any victim of crime wants answers and resolution. And that's obviously been a complex matter that wasn't straightforward. And there's been a conviction, but we just got to be mindful where there's going to be an appeal, and we have to, careful what we say around that.
Totally.
But the police officers equally, would love to resolve matters much sooner, but we're dealing with criminals who, think like criminals, and we don't think like criminals. So, sometimes you've got to put all those things together and try different types of investigative strategies, and, difficult. The Dawson case, as you know, and there's new legislation go before Cabinet this week, I think, around no body, no parole type of thing, because families want answers. And without a body, that makes it even harder because you've got no forensic evidence to work with. So they're very, very complex, and, they happen, but we're pretty, tenacious, and that one's, has gone well.
Because, I guess to some extent, the beyond all reasonable doubt burden that the prosecution, which is the police, well, not the police, but it sort of is the police. You have that obligation to prove that to either the jury or the judge. Is a pretty heavy burden of proof.
It is, because you've basically got to show that every other possible viable, explanation is not viable. So it's not just saying, well, here's the evidence to show that. You've almost got to discount every other as well, because that would be, used in their defence. So it's actually, that's what makes it complex. You've actually got to go about disproving or evidence contrary to the other theories.
Which means you've got to build a whole lot of evidence, both that contradicts whatever the defence's position will be, but also makes it clear that this individual had the intent to commit the crime, the means to commit the crime, and that's why the body part's important, did commit the crime in the case of, say, murder, for example. So therefore, are you saying, do you think that today that the burden of proof is so heavy with so many possibilities, that you have to deal with, that therefore it does take 20 years, 30 years, or just a bloody long time to get the evidence?
Yeah.
And it has to be really well put
It does.
together.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in that. I think, and I had 5 years in for our forensics area, so I got to understand it when CSI, the TV show, was, popular, that it did change communities' expectations that crime could be solved in an hour. There's all of this technology, and we identify DNA and fingerprints and all, put the offender at the crime scene. That's all done. And I think that helped shape community, that they expect more and more quickly. Technology does exist, not necessarily always in Australia, and we've got to send evidence overseas, and that all takes time. But we do have to work methodically through it. So the more evidence that could be available, the more time it takes to analyse. So all the CCTV, all the other technology advances, all of that has to be ingested and made sense of. And at the moment, it's still a manual process. I've got officers that have got to spend hours and hours and hours going through every CCTV footage from a crime scene or around a crime scene, an expanded crime scene, to see if there's anything they can get from that could be evidence. So it does take time.
So in other words, the technology actually creates the time.
It does, actually increases the burden and expectation. Yeah. There's more and more of it and more layers, but then there's the tools to analyse all of that are not as really available to ingest it and just turn it through a machine.
Yeah, so once the crime's been committed, the evidence which is being gathered, either through technology or otherwise, is so great and can easily be discounted in a case by a good barrister because they just have to say, well, put some doubt on that, there's some doubt around that it does actually take a lot more time.
Yeah.
But given, and I understand that part, but given that that's when the crime's been committed, what about the evidence, though, that you can now collect before a crime's committed?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, preventing big drug deals or preventing a gangland murder, because there's a lot of stuff in the media about this stuff at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there more? Do you have more tools available today than you have had in the past? And is it more?
We're
effective?
getting more. In fact, I think Cabinet passed some more legislation yesterday, or today maybe, which will be useful. So we're always trying to keep up. Criminals don't use the normal bounds of law and legislation that we have to use. So they're well ahead of the game and they're well resourced to advance their causes in many different ways. But we've got to catch up. And that sometimes requires legislation to make sure that we can get evidence legally then to catch up to them.
Well, it's always confounded me, but why do you think criminals are so smart? They seem to be one step ahead technologically and one step ahead all the time.
I think, what we're seeing is that they're global networks now, and so they've got access to technology overseas or resources overseas. They're very well organised these days, and like I said, we need law to actually access the things that they're innovating, just to keep up to them, and we are, but it just takes time, unfortunately.
I mean, one of the things that always concerns me is the potential for peripheral damage from these gang wars as an innocent bystander. Is that something that keeps you awake?
Of course it does. Absolutely it does. And there's rhetoric that, they're only shooting themselves, but that's you can't say that. And there is always a risk. And I've said publicly that they're very public these days. Some of them are, in gyms and public places, and that just confounds me that they're so brazen, that they're just willing to take that risk because of the high stakes. But we've got to take that incentive away and most of the incentive, is around money, and money's either drugs or some other commodity that's of value. So we've got to chip away at that. The motive, often it's about the motive.
It's interesting because if I go back 20, 30 years, the old school crooks just stuck with themselves and generally speaking did move out of their own environments. And you might see a few flashy ones around Double Bay, but you sort of knew they might have the jewellery or some fancy car. When I was a kid at the time or a young man at the time. But today they don't stick to themselves. They're a lot more dangerous because they don't care who they affect, in what part of the community they affect it, just to get their outcome. Is that a noted change in criminology?
I suppose I'm not sure what the academics would say about it, but certainly as a veteran of 35 years, as a detective, we'd be happy back in the day to get ounces of drugs of drug dealers, etc. And now we're finding, we're talking tons, because Australia is a demand market, but they're well organised. And then I think their business model has adapted to go, there's a bigger earn if we just do it differently. So some of those rings we've smashed, operate, Strike for Sugarcane and all of those, that wasn't selling bulk. It was selling regularly to across the network every day. So their business model was just a pyramid model, but works very successfully until we got stuck into them. But they've certainly matured around how to do business, and it's not just about hanging around in your own group anymore. I think they cross-pollinate, they come together for mutual benefit.
Which sort of makes sense. I mean, that's in a business sense, if you can justify the business, but it sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you're the CEO of an organisation's out there to bust these organisations. Their job is to beat you. And to some
They're
extent,
not necessarily trying to beat me, they're just trying to do business.
But the police.
Yeah.
Because you're the biggest imposition in terms of their success.
We get in their way, yeah.
And how do you think you're going? I mean, do you think
I
police
think
are doing well?
I think we're doing well, but like I said, I'm just amazed at, how big a consumer market New South Wales is for drugs. That does surprise me. We did an Operation Fume last weekend, which was targeting drug and drunk drivers, and 1 in 17 drug tests were positive. So that's across all of New South Wales.
1 in 17.
1 in 17. So, that's frightening, really. So we're not talking about, a particular demographic. It's much broader now. And I think, other organisations do wastewater testing, and, you can profile communities by the types of drugs that are in the wastewater, and different communities use different drugs, but they're all illegal drugs. And these are just the illegal ones. This is not anything to do with someone that might be mixing, and taking prescribed drugs wrongly. This is the illegals. So, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, cannabis, 1 in 17.
When it's so large, because I've heard stories where Australia is one of the most expensive places in the world to buy, say, cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it must become a very attractive market for those who export and those who import from exporters to Australia. But also we got heroin and methamphetamine and marijuana and everything else that there is out there. How does the police decide which areas are going to be, because you can't do everything, which areas we're going to go for? We're going to go for the people down in the city there who are buying an ounce of hash or whatever it is they're buying in Chinatown or down where the movie theatres are, something like that, or are we going to go for the big guys? I mean, how do you make those calls?
I think there's a bit of everything in that. You've got to, we're after the suppliers, but sometimes you've got to start low-level suppliers and work your way up, and other times you can, come straight in at the top. But there's multiple layers, obviously. Like I said, it's almost like a pyramid. So there's the dealer style networks that make an earn, but there's someone above them that's making a bigger earn, and someone above them. So from the importation, and that's the work that we do with our federal counterparts, right down to, grassroots supply. I mean, we're concerned about the suppliers. That's our area of focus.
If you're in a country like, I don't know, I think it's Sweden, Ramsay, one of those sort of places where they said, look, from now on, this particular drug is not going to be illegal. What does that do? is that a relief? You know, well, we just go for murderers and we'll go for
Yeah.
robberies.
I actually haven't had a look at how that's worked for them and what it looks like. I mean, it does pose a lot of concerns for communities. You know, how do you, even my workforce, you know, how do you say it's legal, but then they've got to turn up to work and not be drug affected, and you know, what does it do to individuals, you know, around causing psychosis or schizophrenia and all those sorts of things. So it's a big question, and I think it's been going around for years. And, you know, I just say to our people, you know, our job's to uphold the law, and the current law says that, you know, it's an offence, like I said, but our focus is suppliers. You know, not necessarily, you know, I know people use drugs and it's against the law, but it's the people that are making money off other people that concerns us.
Yeah, so the illegal sale of something that's not regulated.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of where I was going to. Does Karen Webb and all your senior management team, how do you not make a moral judgment and just say, or an ethical judgment, and just say, look, my job is to uphold the law, and this is the current law, irrespective of how I feel about it. I mean, a good example is domestic violence. Domestic violence has become a big issue, not only in terms of being committed, but much more awareness around it. And now there's a lot more offences in relation to it, like a lot more law around it.
Yeah.
Whereas 30 years ago, probably no one ever talked about it and just happened and it got hidden. How do you balance up your ethics and your morality with the legislation, whichever way it moves?
Yeah, and that's the point I made earlier about if your personal values are no longer aligned, like if you can't do your job because you've got a difference of opinion about a certain issue, then there's got to be a parting of the ways, you know. And we even had police officers that, I think there was some proposed mining up north, and, you know, they had families that owned the land, and, you know, so they had a personal view about it, but they had a job to do to stop protests and things, and that puts them in a difficult position. But I just say you just got to do your job, and just, you know, do it ethically, and you know, so some people do get vexed.
Well, COVID's a good example.
Yeah.
And people get, well, not so much in this state, but in other states like
Yeah.
Victoria, people getting arrested left, right and centre. And we saw a lot of stuff around that. As a leader of the organisation, I mean, how do you talk to your people about that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think it is interesting you talk about that, because we debriefed, I guess you could say, some potential recruits about, you know, whether they join the police or want to join the police, or why they're not pursuing their interest to join the police. And there were two answers. You know, one was that they didn't like what the police, meaning, I don't know whether it's New South Wales or just Australia broadly, what police did during COVID, which was interesting. And I don't know whether that was, you know, didn't like us standing around guarding hotels, or was, you know, arresting mums and dads for not wearing face masks. And the other was around Black Lives Matter. So there's a couple of things that have actually affected our appeal, I suppose, which is, you know, something we have to grapple with, because we need to understand why people don't want to join, and then, well, how do we remedy that and reconcile that? And now that, you know, thankfully COVID's, you know, becoming normal and we're living with COVID, then how do we, you know, attract people back?
It's interesting. I mean, if I give you one example, during the COVID period, when that very first guy, the driver dude, contracted it.
Yes.
He went to a cafe in Vaucluse, and I was actually going to my farm, and on the way to the airport, I stopped into that particular cafe. On the very day that he was there, I bought a cup of coffee outside because I was in a hurry to go to the airport, and then went to the airport. I was only going to my farm for a day, came back that night, and the next morning I got a phone call from an odd number with an American accent or Canadian accent, as it turned out. I didn't answer it because I thought it might have been one of those weird calls. So then it rang me 3 or 4 times. I just I'm not going to answer that because I don't know the number. I don't know the accent. Then some police from Rose Bay, a guy and a girl, 2 constables come in, and they knocked on my gate. And I said, yeah, who's that? Because my dog started barking. Actually, an ex-police dog out of Menai, which I rescued.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
Because he failed the slippery floor test.
Oh,
and the guy in charge there who I knew said, oh, mate, you can have his dog.
Yeah.
I paid for him, I should say, but I didn't have him. I had to pay him.
No.
But anyway, I'm happy to rescue him. But my dog was young mental, and they obviously were just not going to go very gingerly. And said, yeah, who's that? What do you want? And so we're from Rose Bay Police. And I said, oh, what do you want? and they said, "Oh, you've been getting a call from New South Wales Health, I think whatever it's called." And I said,
Right.
"Oh yeah." And
Contract
so I said, "Just
tracing.
come down here and
Yeah.
let me come and talk to you." Turns out that New South Wales Health had found out my details because I pay by credit card, and they got my
Okay.
mobile number from my
Right.
bank.
Wow.
And which I thought the bank should tell me, but they were actually ringing me. So, and the lady just happened to be Canadian accent. That's all. And she was just actually saying to me, I had to go and get a PCR test, what it was at the time.
Yeah.
And just to say, the two constables were very nice. They knew it was a bit of a hassle.
Yeah.
But they said, "Look, we
They
got
had
a
a job to
call.
do.
Can you just give them a call, Mark?"
Sure.
I don't know if they call me Mark, Mr. Bouris, but you just give them a call,
Yeah.
and it'll be all okay. And I was happy enough to give them a call, no dramas. And then once I knew what was going on.
Yeah.
So in terms of just perception, is that it's probably the way police
You
deal with
deliver a
things.
message. Yeah.
And they were young people. I'm an older dude, so they probably thought, "Oh, just be respectful to the older bloke," There were just two young cops, though. That's
Yes.
the way I saw it,
Yeah.
doing their job.
Yep.
And there was no barging in or knocking down the bloody gate or anything like that, or threatening to arrest me. They were just very nice, and I thought, well, that's okay, it's cool.
Yeah.
That's, to me, is the way I see it. But then again, people from the west of Sydney during the COVID period, and it was pre your time as the commissioner, but they felt as though they were being singled out with police helicopters and stuff flying around the place. How do you send them the message? Look, we're just doing our job.
Yeah.
This is what we have to do. This is what's being required of us under whatever the legislation was.
Yeah.
How do you do that and
Well,
bring that
actually,
awareness?
We actually worked with a number of peak groups. So the Multicultural Advisory Committee, and it's got representatives from various communities, but particularly in Southwest Sydney communities, with them to help us with messaging. We had messaging in multiple languages, and just actually hit the pavement. And we, sent cops out delivering hampers, so we actually, went out en masse, put extra cops in there to just not to be, show of force, actually, peacekeeping type activity to make sure families were getting that access to things they needed. So just being on the front foot around that messaging. And I know some of my region commanders and deputies all worked really hard to, try and make sure that didn't turn the wrong way. It could have gone one of two ways. And, there was that group of LGAs that were affected because of the incidence of COVID in that area or whatever the reason was that the health order was put in place. So it's difficult because, our boundaries aren't, people don't know what our boundaries are, and it's not necessarily a neat road. So it's difficult. It's a job even for the police that I live or work in there, or the ones seconded in there. I'm trying to understand, that street on that side's the boundary and that one's not. And so it
did make sense.
No, it was tricky. It's a tricky time.
It was orange zone and red zone.
Yeah.
But if you go back, and if I go back too, because I actually had the same relationship in where I grew up. But if you go back to the day when you did your driving test with the policeman, local policeman, and where you came, in the area you came from, that view of the police would never have happened back then because that individual had a relationship already with everybody in the town.
Yes.
Is it a fact or matter that today it's more difficult to build those relationships just by virtue of sheer numbers of people, particularly in the city or Southwest Sydney? I mean, it's just difficult for police to have a relationship with their community, except when these things happen, then you have to build a relationship.
Well, that's the worst scenario, is building a relationship in time of crisis.
Yeah.
You've got to build your relationships before a crisis, because that's when you can make those calls and people will rally with you. So one of my priorities is actually connected community, and that's about connecting at all levels, whether it's my level or constables on the ground, but at local levels, so that local commanders and command teams have forums or mechanisms to understand what their community wants from them, and that will vary community to community. But they in some commands they've existed for years. They just continue to roll, and others where they've fallen away, they'll come back again. But whether it's by geographic area or whether it's by head of profession, meaning domestic violence groups come together, and sexual violence, and those retail associations come together to understand how we reconnect if we've we've lost that connection and, listen to what their needs are.
So what about remote areas, like Indigenous remote people? So let's pick Bouris, for example, as a place I know there's a lot of Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
How do you sort of build the relationship up with the community before a problem arises?
Yeah. Well, again, we've got police that have been stationed out there, and they might come and go over the years, but they stay for 3 or more years. Some stay, they like it and stay. But again, the same principles apply, establishing those relationships, getting those people into a room, understanding what their issues are. We had a recent coroner's matter up there, and, I was concerned that it would, there was tensions that could have boiled over in that community, but it was the good work of that officer in charge and her team up there. They're able to work with the community to make sure that, they were heard. We managed, their expectations, and that's the way to do it. You've got to have those relationships. You got to it's like any relationship, you just got to work on it the whole time.
It's interesting you should say that, because one of the things that's come out of the death of the Queen Elizabeth
Yes.
is one of the things I've got from it all is how across everything she was, particularly for her age. She was on top of everything. And then my own imagination, because I have no insight whatsoever, but my imagination is that she's been continually being briefed on stuff of state matters that relate to her, literally all day, every day, and had been for 70 years during her reign, and never faltered. Not to say you're equivalent Queen Elizabeth II, but maybe. But your role is about being across every issue of this state and making sure that the people who brief you in a non-agenda way. When this is a time when Karen Webb should step in. I should be present. I should go to Bouris, or I should turn up to Broken Hill, or I should turn up to Lismore for the floods, or whatever it is. Is that something that you do? Is that how you operate?
Yeah. So
and how do you tell us all that? How do you tell us about that?
Yeah, we, I guess there's a balance between, as I said, probationary constable through to commissioner, and I've got deputies, assistant commissioners, and commanders have all got responsibility. So there is a fine line between seeing too much of Karen Webb when it's an issue a deputy could deal with, or an assistant commissioner or commander, that they've all got a role in communicating with their communities as well. And whatever the issue is, we use all forms of media, like our public affairs unit and our media unit, media releases, but Facebook and iWatch and all those digital means now really have enormous reach. So they're ways, LinkedIn. So there's lots of different ways we communicate what's happening in the organisation and trying to reach everyone, as well as those people that don't have access to digital, and we're still reaching in the traditional ways. So it's varied, I guess, is the point. Often it's communicate continually. But there's so many things.
Do you ever feel yourself, you wake up in the morning and say, wow, I should be maybe putting my face in front of this one because I'm the leader of the organisation? You're our leader too. As a community, you're our safety leader. Yeah. Let's call it that. Probably other words to describe it, that you're our safety leader. And sometimes we don't want to see too much of you because, we might think you're trying to promote yourself.
Again.
But at the same time, it's a fine balance anyway.
It is.
And you've got a team of people who advise you these things, about these things, as did the Queen.
Yeah.
But the Queen was always very much, in my view, the Queen was the best female CEO of the business of being royal that the world has ever seen.
Yeah.
And she ran a business.
Yeah.
A big enterprise. And you run a big enterprise. And she was much more experienced at it than you, because she was at it for 70 years. You've only been at a short period. But is there anything inspirational about how she conducted herself in being the CEO of that big organisation that you could draw from?
Yeah, I just think, I don't know the Queen. I've had the privilege of meeting King Charles when he was in Australia a few years ago. When I look at the Queen, just my assessment, I guess, just based on what I see, very authentic, down to earth, still got a sense of humour, normal, she's mother. She's done all of those things and just stayed grounded. And I think I try and do that. I'm a mother. I try and be my normal self, try and be authentic and be an active listener. And I just, I take in everything, every day, every morning, 5 o'clock, Bing comes in, what's been happening overnight, 5 p.m. in the afternoon, briefing for the media unit, 8 o'clock briefing every day, so I'm briefed all the time. And that about when I stand up and when I don't, it is a fine line, because sometimes it's could be dealt with at an assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner level. That's why I have them. And then other times, I'll step in. So it is, and maybe I'm still learning. And I always say, if I'm not still learning and enjoying this job, then it's time for me to retire. But I'll be still learning. It's only 9 months, so I've still got to find that balance maybe. But I'm not sure there's a formula. It's just a judgment.
It'll become your formula though over time.
Yeah, and I'm different. I think every commissioner, every CEO is different. So I can't be compared to past CEOs. I'll do it my way, and I am different. I'll bring something different to the role, and I've got to manage my time that I'm spending time in my organisation with my people, as well as my stakeholders on the outside, my community. So it's just trying to manage what percentage of my time am I devoting to all of those. So I have a bit of control over that, and otherwise I'm just pushed from here to pillar to post. So just trying to manage what's the right mix, because I think it's important that my organisation, my people know that I'm there for them, but also got to manage, my board.
It's very interesting. I want to say this to you because time is against us, but as an observation, one, I thank you for explaining to us who Commissioner Webb is, the CEO of the organisation, but also showing us Karen Webb at the same time, and trying to, because I think that point, you're always learning about your role and about how to best do it, will get you out of a lot of trouble, so to speak, because people all think that about themselves. I mean, I do, and I think everybody does. Yeah. Instead of coming to this interview and saying, I know everything and I'm here to kill it, that's really refreshing, and I think that we get confidence out of that. Yeah. And I also think the structural part of the business is very important. Yeah. You've got good people to rely on. As you know, I know some of these individuals, and they're very good people, high quality individuals. And so I think from a community's point of view, I want to thank you for taking on the role. That's for a start. But putting a female into that role, and I know you just treat everyone the same, but a different point of view is very important for all of us as a community. Yeah. So thanks very much, Commissioner Webb.
Thank you
for your very authentic and honest view of Karen Webb.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been great.